and elsewhere. We're presenting this avant-garde music, essentially, both to community audiences and to audiences that come from afar. And we're bringing underexposed and often unrecognized artists to our stages. This mandate involves the programming of an art form that is primarily derived out of the experiences and experimentalist impulses of peoples of African descent, that now has practitioners and enthusiasts from around the world. Now, in thinking about how my artistic vision and programming mandate, has sought to create opportunities and audiences for performances by diverse artists, culturally diverse artists, I'm particularly interested in reflecting on the question of how, as arts presenters, we might best play a role in interculturalizing the field. That is, in terms of the range and the scope of cultural references that the field, and in this case, I'm talking about the field of innovative jazz and creative improvised music. So, extending the range and scope of cultural references that the field takes on. Well, I can tell you that at the Guelph Jazz Festival, I've sought to do this, to interculturalize the field, by bringing together ad hoc groupings of artists from different cultures. If you've been to the festival, you'll know that one of the things that we do is we bring together artists on stage who've often never met. So much of the music that I program involves this kind of real-time improvisational musical encounter. And think about what happens in that context. A group of people who may never have met, who in many cases know very little, if anything, about one another, who may not even speak the same language. They often come from very different cultural backgrounds. They can come together and they can create inspired and compelling music. And moreover, they can do this on the spot with no explicit prearranged musical direction. Remember that they are improvising on the spot, and in many cases, they're meeting for the first time on stage. What makes it work? And what does this tell us? How might such musical examples enable us to think about what it means to negotiate difference and diversity within the context of a community? What it means to be living in a culturally diverse society? In addition to creating opportunities for these sorts of intercultural improvised encounters, I've also sought to extend the range and scope of cultural references in the field of jazz and improvised music through the commissioning of new work. Of particular interest in the context of this town hall's focus on cultural pluralism in the arts is a new jazz opera that I commissioned to mark our festival's 10th anniversary in 2003. Entitled Québécité, the opera, with music by Dee Dee Jackson and a libretto by George Eliot Clarke, explicitly reflects and supports our festival's continuing efforts to present culturally diverse forms of music both to new audiences and to aficionados from around the world. Enlarging on the success of George Eliot Clarke's previous opera, which was called Beatrice Chancey, which was about slavery in Canada, Québécité was in part an attempt to encourage more artists to base creative projects on themes and subjects of more specific and immediate social and cultural relevance to Canadians. Québécité is a 3-act multicultural romance set in modern-day Quebec City. The plot tells the story of 2 interracial couples whose respective and developing romances expose the inherent minefield of establishing relationships that cross racial and cultural boundaries. The principal characters are Lakshmi Bharati, a student architect born in Bombay, Ovid Rambeau, an architect originally from Haiti, Colette Chan, a law student whose parents, avid jazz fans, fled the Tiananmen massacre to find refuge in Canada, and jazz pianist Malcolm States, a native black Nova Scotian currently playing at a jazz club owned by Colette's parents. As the story unfolds, the couples learn to navigate the stormy waters of gender, race, and culture in order to establish relationships based on love that are firmly rooted in mutual respect and understanding. Relationships strong enough to withstand the trials of opposing parents and clashing cultures. The story, in short, demands involvement from artists who are sensitive to the politics, the pitfalls, and the possibilities of cross-cultural communication. As a composer, Dee Dee Jackson was ideally positioned to take on such a challenge, not only because of his own mixed-race background, but also because, as so many of his projects demonstrate, he's a relentless innovator whose work has always sought to find creative and articulate ways to synthesize a diverse range of influences. The featured vocalist for the opera included Hayden Neal, the dynamic young African-Canadian leader of the popular R&B acid jazz group Jack Soul. Hayden, as many of you will know, passed away last month after a battle with lung cancer. Acclaimed Toronto-based Indian vocalist Kiran Ahluwalia, avant jazz gospel singer from New York, Dean Bowman, and New York-based Korean-Canadian experimental jazz vocalist Yoon Choi. The opera was directed by African-Canadian director Colin Taylor. Now, from my deliberate emphasis on the diverse and hyphenated identities of the production's principals, you'll recognize that in casting the opera, we deliberately sought to choose artists, many of whom, including the composer and the librettist, had not previously worked together. We chose artists who enabled us to broaden and diversify the constituency traditionally defined as a jazz audience. Diverse in cultural backgrounds, as you heard, and also, of course, in the musical context for which they were best known: Punjabi folk songs, acid hip-hop jazz, classical music, gospel roots, alternative rock, avant-garde jazz, R&B, creative improvised music, etc. The opera's unique cast played a key role in helping us reach out to new target audiences with this production, especially more young people, opera fans who would not otherwise have attended our festival, and of course audiences associated with the diverse musics of various world folk traditions. Add to that mix the fact that the libretto was written by African-Canadian and award-winning author George Eliot Clarke, and the result was an explicit broadening of the cultural scope and subject matter for new Canadian opera. And this, of course, is in keeping not only with our nation's stated multicultural objectives, but also, I would say, with the democratizing impulses that, in its most provocative instances, has shaped so much of the history of jazz and creative improvised music. In short, the opera was part of an effort to reflect and to project a much-desired image of Canadian plurality and diversity across the nation and indeed throughout the world. Now, I've already said a few words about audience development through my comments about the opera, and if there's time, I have a clip I can play you from the opera later. But I want to say here, just to add to the comments I've made about audience development, the other most significant aspects of our audience building strategies for the festival have to do with our educational and outreach components. The Guelph Jazz Festival is the only jazz festival in Canada that has as a regular component of its schedule of events an academic colloquium. So built into the festival is essentially a 3-day conference, which interweaves with the performances. The colloquium seeks to bring together diverse constituencies and communities of interest by providing a unique educational forum for dialogue and discussion among scholars, musicians, and members of the general public. Perhaps more than any other aspect of our festival, this colloquium, which many people call the gem of the event, has built an audience for the music, and it's built a really diverse audience for the music we present. And this is a music that, in some other context, might seem challenging or off-putting, right? Additionally, the festival has expanded its outreach initiatives with an off-season Jazz in the Schools program, and more recently, in association with the Improvisation Community and Social Practice Project, we've partnered with community-based social service organizations to run a whole series of workshops on improvisation, in particular with aggrieved and at-risk youth in the community. Through these partnerships, we put improvising musicians in direct and meaningful contact with marginalized youth. The benefits of these kinds of partnerships are many. They serve to break down silos, to bridge gaps, and to enable different kinds of people and different kinds of organizations to come together, to engage in a productive process of knowledge exchange. Now, part of what's at issue here, in fact, is the need to increase and diversify the base of valued knowledges, to enable understanding of the diversity of educational principles and sources of knowledge. Using improvisation as a pedagogical model in these communities, in other words, allows creative practitioners to tap into principles of learning that come out of diverse communities that have not historically been valued. These improvisational workshops have been an important tool in building new and diverse audiences for the music in Guelph. The challenges? Well, there's, of course, the obvious and ongoing problem of funding, always challenging. But the difficulties are compounded when, as in the case of our festival, we're dealing with non-mainstream forms of artistic expression. There's also, I would say, the need to unsettle implicit but somehow lingering assumptions that still, I think, are in place for many presenters. Assumptions that the exercise of diversifying may be happening at the expense of what they would call tradition and quality. Read mainstream music making. So I would ask, what kind of paradigm shift would it take to encourage the development of a community of practice for arts organizations to build their knowledge and their capacities in the area of cultural diversity? What kinds of changes in policies and institutions would we need to implement such a vision? The examples I've tried to discuss through my work with the Guelph Jazz Festival are, at least in some measure, offered to you as documents of hope. For they suggest, in their own modest way, that, well, yes, it is possible, even for arts organizations presenting avant-garde improvised small community markets, to develop purposeful relationships that will bring about greater understanding of culturally diverse performances and their audiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajay. I don't know about the rest of you. I have a lot of questions. But what we thought we might try to do, because it's a relatively intimate group, maybe take one or two questions in between each of the speakers and then have a discussion at the end. We'll see how that works.
That's a good question. So the question is, how do I know that we've built an audience through the colloquium? Yeah, we do a number of things. We have surveys every year at the festival, and the colloquium often gets mentioned as the source of the festival that has educated people about the music, and more people are coming as a result of that. I think partly there's an aspect to the colloquium that has to do with the intimacy of the event, the fact that we're putting artists in direct contact with people in the community. They can, it's an intimate setting, and they can ask questions. They can hear the performers speak about what they do. They can hear them perform in these kind of ad hoc workshops where they're meeting other musicians on stage for the first time, which somehow makes this music that is, potentially quite challenging for a lot of people, welcoming in a way that wouldn't be if they were just, hearing the music in a sort of traditional performance setting. So I think there are a number of things that have indicated to us that the audience for the music is growing as a result of the colloquium. But I think it's the educative aspect, the fact that people have told us over and over again that they really appreciate this opportunity to have direct contact with these artists in an intimate setting. Do we have tools to measure how many audience members are first-timers? Again, the best tool we have, and it's not particularly scientific, and I would welcome comments from people about how we can do this better. But we do have an annual survey that we give out to our audience members, and it does ask, if they've attended the festival before. That's one of the questions. So that is the tool that we use. We do. It depends, from year to year. I'd say we have many people coming back. It's a very dedicated audience for innovative music, and a large out-of-town audience. We have people coming, as I said, from all across the States, from all across Europe, from all across Canada, who come year after year. And word-of-mouth advocacy is very, powerful. And they bring their friends, they bring their families, they bring their colleagues. So, but yes, each year we are getting new people who've heard about the festival in various places and will come out. So it's growing. It is growing. Well, sure. I mean, the opera that I spoke about was not, not an ad hoc improvisation. It was fully composed with improvisational elements. So a lot of the, the kind of commissioning work that I do is part of that process of interculturalizing. But the music that we highlight does tend to be creative improvised music for the most part. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on, and I just have a little comment to add to that. There's many festivals and jazz festivals in Ontario that take the other approach. So you're really serving a